Varför är det välstånd i vissa länder och fattigdom i andra? En aspekt som forskarna ofta har missat är religionens betydelse. Ja, det menar i alla fall professorn Paul Segerstrom som gästar oss ikväll. Varmt välkommen till programmet Närbild som ikväll handlar om kristendomens betydelse för västvärldens framgång. Varmt välkommen Paul Segerstrom, professor i internationell ekonomi vid Handelshögskolan i Stockholm.
Tack.
Och Paul är amerikan så vi kommer ta resten av den här intervjun på engelska. So, first of all, what brought you to Sweden?
The short answer is my wife is from Finland.
Okay.
So I grew up in the United States. I'm a U.S. citizen. We got married and we lived for around 10 years in Michigan. And my wife was getting tired of the cornfields of Michigan and eager to move back to Europe and be closer to her relatives. So what I did was I applied for professor positions in Stockholm. Stockholm was, for my field economics, Stockholm was a better place to be than, say, Helsinki.
Yeah.
I applied and I got a very attractive job offer at Stockholm School of Economics. So we moved.
Great, we're glad to have you here.
Yeah.
But your last name sounds very Swedish. Do you have Swedish ancestors?
It is. I'm an unusual immigrant to Sweden because I am actually half Swedish by descent. My father's father and my father's mother were born in Sweden. And in the real heart of Sweden, Eskilstuna area and Motala.
Okay.
So I am half Swedish by descent. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
But now we're going to talk about your research.
Mm-hmm.
You have been researching about the connection between religion and the extent of prosperity and democracy in different countries.
Yes.
So why did you choose that topic?
I actually originally didn't choose that topic. What I decided was this. I've spent a lot of time as an economics professor teaching various courses in economics at different levels and doing research, publishing papers in top economics journals. And for more than 20 years, and I decided it would be nice to take some time off from the very narrow type of research that one needs to do to get published in academic journals, and just read books on the subject, why are some countries rich and other countries are poor, and evaluate who has the best arguments. What are the arguments that are most convincing? And so I did that. I took some time off from my usual work. I just read book after book on the subject of wealth and poverty of nations. Why are some countries rich and other countries are poor? And the best book I found was not by an economist, but by a historian, Niall Ferguson, who's a professor of history at Harvard University. He had a book that impressed me a lot. And it's in his book that the subject of religion came up. So I was not expecting to do research on religion at all. But what Niall Ferguson basically argued is that the Western world, Western Europe in particular, earlier in time became the most prosperous part of the world. And he argued there's several reasons why that took place, why countries in the West became so rich compared to countries anyplace else. One was there was a higher level of competition in the West than, say, in places like China. And that message confirmed what I had been learning in my own research, so in economics. So the idea that with a higher level of competition, you get better outcomes, higher living standards, it matches up very well with what economists have concluded in their research. So I like that message. And then he had a second chapter where Niall Ferguson argued that science is really important. The scientific revolution took place in Western Europe at a time when nothing was happening in any other region of the world. So all these amazing scientific discoveries were taking place in Europe, and you can't point to anything happening elsewhere. And he argues, well, that's another key for the success of the West. And third chapter, he argues in the West you had stronger protection of private property than any other region of the world. And I felt that matches up very well with conclusions I was drawing from my own research on the effects of enforcement of private property rights. So I was impressed by the general message in that book. It confirmed what I had been learning from my own research. But then what really got interesting for me is when Niall Ferguson argues in late chapters in the book that religion is important in shaping whether or not a country has a high level of competition, whether or not a country has a science-friendly environment, whether or not a country has strong protection of private property. And he pointed to Protestant Christianity as being a particularly favorable religion for supporting things like strong protection of private property rights. So I wasn't expecting to see that message, but it intrigued me that that someone was arguing that that religion is quite important for understanding why some countries are rich and other countries are poor.
So then you started to research that by yourself?
Exactly. Then I started to dig deeper into the subject, and what I learned just confirmed what Niall Ferguson was arguing. For example, I discovered that I discovered a paper by Robert Woodbury about the roots of democratic institutions. He does empirical work where he has data on 140 countries in the non-Western world, and he argues empirically that the early presence of Protestant missionaries helps to explain the extent to which countries have stable democratic institutions later in time. So a simple way of thinking about the result is more Protestant missionaries in, say, 1920, relative to population size, tends to lead to more stable democratic institutions after 1950. So more Protestant missionaries earlier in time, more likely to have democratic institutions later in time. And the effects were really strong. In fact, in the data, the analysis that he runs explains 50% of the variation in the data, looking at 140 countries in the non-Western world, which is most of the countries in the world were in his study. So I was really surprised that there was such a strong relationship between the missionaries and the democratic institutions, and that nobody has noticed this effect in earlier research. This paper was published in 2012. No one doing research on the roots of democracy noticed the connection earlier.
Why is it this connection, you think?
Why is the connection? When I teach the material at the Stockholm School of Economics, one of the arguments that I've got, I think this is wrong, but it's an interesting argument, is that the Protestant missionaries set up schools where their goal was wanted to teach everyone to read the Bible for themselves and make their decision about whether or not to follow Jesus, and that it was the teaching of everyone to read and write which led to the democratic institutions. It's what economists call human capital accumulation. Students have suggested that's what's going on. But that just doesn't seem plausible to me, because there's many countries in the world where the masses know how to read and write. China, for example, high school students in China score better on reading comprehension tests than Swedish high school students. And yet China does not have democratic institutions. It's a Communist Party dictatorship.
Yeah.
So this idea that just learning how to read and write leads to democratic institutions, I don't believe it.
No.
It just doesn't seem plausible.
No.
I think what's going on is they were learning to read the Bible. And there's a big difference between learning to read the Bible and learning to read the Communist Manifesto. When people read the Bible, they encounter a message that they have not seen before. They encounter new values that they haven't seen before, and it's a transforming experience.
Yeah.
And it helps promote democratic institutions, encountering this message that's in the Bible.
Yeah. Yes. But you have also seen a connection between countries' GDP and religion. Can you explain?
Sure. I was very surprised reading one of the books about poverty in the world. The author presented a table where what he does is he takes all the countries in the world and groups countries based on what is the historically dominant religion. So one would be Protestant Christianity. And then he reports in the table how many people, what is the population of all the countries combined where Protestant Christianity is the historically dominant religion. And then he reports GDP per capita, gross domestic product per capita, which is a standard measure of average income that is routinely used by economists. But usually GDP per capita is reported for countries, like GDP per capita for Sweden, GDP per capita for Germany. But this author reports GDP per capita for a group of countries, countries that have the same historically dominant religion. And so Protestant Christianity is one row in the table. Catholic Christianity is another row, Islam is another row, Judaism is another row. And the big surprise for me was Protestant Christianity has the highest average income. The countries, and this is Sweden, United States, United Kingdom, Germany, etc. The countries where Protestant Christianity was the historically dominant religion have average income of around $30,000 US.
Okay.
This was data from 2002, so
Yeah.
it has changed a little bit since then, but much higher than some of the others. Judaism does pretty well. There, the only country is Israel. where Judaism is the historically dominant religion, obviously, but they had an income of around 20,000 US dollars. And
So that's number 2.
that's number 2,
and Judaism.
Judaism.
Yeah.
Number 3 is Catholic Christianity. So we think of countries like France, Italy, Brazil, etc. They had an average income of around $13,000. The big surprise for me was going to the bottom of the list. Buddhism, Islam, and Hinduism are the 3 countries with the lowest average income. I was struck by the extent to which poverty in the world is concentrated in countries with those historically dominant religions. In particular, for Islam, average income was around 3,000 US dollars. So for Protestant Christianity, 30,000.
Yeah.
For Islam, 3,000. It's a 10-fold difference in the data. So I go back to this earlier book by Niall Ferguson, which I think is a very good book for explaining wealth and poverty. And you see that religion matters just by looking at the raw data. You can do more sophisticated analysis and try to determine what is causation, like the research on how Protestant missionaries do things that lead to democratic institutions. That is careful statistical work showing that there is causation going from the Protestant missionaries to the democratic institutions. But just if you look at the raw data,
Yeah.
you see that it seems like religion matters a lot. Yeah, so that's...
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
But you can't find so much about this in books of economics, you said, or among researchers.
No.
Why is it like that, you think?
That's a good question. I think, well, in books written by economists, economists focus on doing religion-free analysis. They just assume that religion doesn't matter, and they do what they do,
Yeah.
without even stating that this is an assumption or considering whether it's true or not. So economists are, I think, they're in a habit of doing religion-free analysis. They've done this for years and years and years, and it becomes routine, and I don't think they even think about it.
No.
And I don't think they think that they're overlooking anything by ignoring religion in their analysis. And I must confess, I had embraced the same way of thinking earlier in my career without thinking twice. So it wasn't so much that I had seen any research suggesting that religion doesn't matter. You just get used to making the assumption in professional economic work that religion is not needed for studying the issues that you're studying. So, yeah, I think economists make an implicit assumption that religion doesn't matter without thinking twice. And it just becomes so natural and routine, they don't think so much about it. Interestingly, though, there's some examples where economists come out and say openly that religion doesn't matter.
Okay.
For example, there's a best-selling book by Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson called Why Nations Fail, that you can buy in any bookstore that has academic books. And this book has sold a lot. A lot of people in the academic world, and in particular in economics departments, have read the book. And they say in one of the early chapters that religion just isn't just isn't important for understanding the world distribution of income. It's basically, it's not important for understanding why some countries are rich and other countries are poor. Well, I read that book carefully. I discovered that in the book, they never present any evidence that religion doesn't matter. Instead, what they do is, in a footnote at the end of the book, they say, we have shown this in our empirical work, here's the reference. So that got my curiosity up. I got the journal article that they were referring to, printed it out, I carefully read it, and I came to the realization they have not actually shown that religion doesn't matter, and it's not true. So when they say that religion doesn't matter, they are overselling what they have really shown in their research. And that can happen a lot.
Yeah.
That researchers oversell what they are showing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what reactions have you gotten on your research among colleagues?
Largely silence.
Okay.
Largely silence. But some positive comments from students. I've been teaching this material for 4 years now at the Stockholm School of Economics, and some students tell me they really appreciate it. It was eye-opening experience.
Yeah.
I got an email, for example, from a student from University of Bocconi, who was an exchange student visiting the Stockholm School of Economics, and he told me he really liked my course. It was very thought-provoking.
Okay.
So I get some
Great.
very positive reactions.
Great.
Yeah.
To hear.
And teaching evaluations are pretty good. Yeah.
So what is it in the Christian faith that is good for society?
Good question. Good question. I think there's many things. It's one could construct a long list of reasons, but maybe let me focus in on something that people may not have thought about that I think is important. In the early part of the Bible, I'm thinking of the books of Genesis and Exodus, the 5 books of Moses. There is, in the early part of the Bible, a message, a clear message that slavery is wrong. In the book of Exodus, the narrative, the storytelling, communicates this message that slavery is wrong. The Jewish people are slaves in Egypt, and God delivers them from slavery and leads them into the promised land. So that the narrative clearly communicates that slavery is wrong. But what I've discovered is also the legal code part of Exodus communicates that slavery is wrong. This is something that I hadn't seen before I started studying the issues deeply. But in the legal code, the God's commandments, the harshest punishment is assigned for kidnapping another human being. So and kidnapping another human being is how people originally become slaves.
Yeah.
In reality, this is how slavery begins, is when human beings are kidnapped. So through the legal code, the Bible is communicating that slavery is wrong. Through the narrative, the Bible is communicating that slavery is wrong. And the few verses in the Bible that seem to suggest otherwise are not really talking about slavery. They're really talking about indentured servitude, which in ancient Israel was a substitute for a prison system. So properly understood, the Bible has a clear anti-slavery message, and that is unique, actually.
And that's good for the economy and the
And
democracy.
it's good for the economy, but going back to my earlier point, if you look at other religious texts, you do not find this message. In any other ancient religious texts, you do not find the message that slavery is wrong. And also in Islamic religious texts, you do not find the message that slavery is wrong. The Prophet Muhammad himself was a slave owner. So you don't get an anti-slavery message from Islamic texts. So it's the Bible teaches that slavery is wrong, and the Bible is the origin of the message that slavery is wrong. And I think this has profoundly shaped societies for the better.
Yeah.
It was, if you go back and you study history, it was Christians that led the fight to abolish slavery in, for example, the British Empire, in early United States history, and in many other countries.
Yeah.
It was Christian. I've read extensively about the country of Namibia in southern Africa, and it was Christian missionaries that went to Namibia that really pushed for the abolition of slavery. It's very clear from studying the details of the history.
But are there more things in the Christian faith that is good for society apart from this?
Of course, of course.
And the economy and the democracy.
Another good thing is the Bible teaches respect for private property, and that message is very strong in the early parts of the Bible. One of the 10 Commandments is do not steal. And there's numerous other commandments that are promoting respect for private property. And in the book of Exodus, one of the details that has really jumped out at me when I read it recently and put on my economist hat, think about the economic implications of what is being communicated, I noticed that Abraham was a successful businessman. He's described in the Bible as being very rich. And yet at the same time, he walks with God. So that message communicates in a startling way respect for private property. And then his son, Isaac, he is described as being hardworking, successful businessman, engaged in a different type of business, but also successful, and that's communicating respect for private property. And then the third generation, Jacob, he's also described as being, in a different activity, a successful businessman with substantial ownership of property. Yeah.
Great.
So there is a message there. Christians, I think, often ignore it, but historically, it was very important in shaping things, how things turned out. The countries where Christianity and the Bible had the greatest influence tended to have strong protection of private property, and that contributed to prosperity. I think there's a lot of things you could mention about the Christian faith that are good for society. Let me give you a third example, charitable giving. I was very surprised when I started to look at the scholarly literature on charitable giving. One researcher who studied the United States, where there's very good data on charitable giving because people get a tax deduction for giving money to various charitable organizations, and thus the tax authorities collect the information about how much everybody gives. So there's very good data. So a researcher who carefully studied this issue, named Arthur Brooks, he spent 10 years studying the data, doing careful statistical analysis, and asking the question, why is it that some people give a lot of money to charitable causes and others give hardly any money? What are the key driving factors? And what he found, of all the variables that he included in his statistical analysis, what he found was the most important variable was religion. Mm-hmm. And he measured religion as people attending church on a weekly basis. That was his measure of a religious person is a person who attends church on a weekly basis, typically. He found that those people, and these are overwhelmingly in the U.S. Christians, are the most generous in giving to charitable causes. And they're not just giving to the church that they attend, but they're also doing things like donating blood, volunteering their time, giving money to secular organizations that they support. It's just an overall higher level of generosity. And you get more human flourishing in a society where people are more generous, where people are doing more things to help others. Mm-hmm. You get better general outcomes. Yeah. It's not, I don't think this is rocket science, but the evidence is very clear that the religious people are considerably more generous in giving money to charitable organizations. And that has huge benefits in general. Mm-hmm. It creates what economists call positive externalities within a society when people are more generous.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, we are running out of time, but I have two last questions.
Sure.
So you can answer them shortly.
Yeah.
First of all, in the 19th century, many Swedes were Christians, but we were very poor. So how do you explain that?
Easy. That's an easy question. It really doesn't need an explanation, because if you go back in time, everyone was poor in every country around the world. And furthermore, you don't have to go back too far. 200 years is enough to get this outcome that by today's standards, people were very poor in Sweden, but also very poor in China, very poor in Kenya, very poor in Mexico. For me, poverty doesn't need an explanation. It's actually wealth that needs an explanation. So I look at Sweden, I say, there's no need to explain why people are poor. But what is really interesting about Sweden is that from around 1850 to 1950, during that 100-year time interval, Sweden went from being very poor to one of the richest countries in the world. Yeah. That's what needs to be explained. Yeah. Yes. So the initial poverty, I don't think we need to offer any explanation. Okay. It's just everyone was poor.
But now we are quite few Christians in Sweden.
Yes.
And we have removed Christianity from schools and from culture. How will that affect our country in the future, you think?
It's not good, but let me explain a little bit. It's true that today there are few Christians. For example, one statistic I've seen is that there's around 3% of the population that attends a Christian church on a typical Sunday morning. So it's true. But it's also true that Christianity has had a big impact on Sweden in transforming the culture. And so there's a lot of people today that are secular, but they live their lives largely guided by Christian values. I know a lot of people at my work that, well, in many respects, they live like a Christian, but they don't go to church.
No.
In some cases, they openly say that they're atheists. And what's going on is, well, they're secular today, but maybe their parents were Christians. So they were brought up, taught to live according to Christian moral values. Or maybe it was the previous generation, maybe it was their grandparents that were Christians, and so they brought up their parents to live according to biblical values. And these become part of the culture, and cultures change very slowly.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, you can say, well, there aren't many Christians in Sweden today, yes, but Sweden is a country that has been heavily influenced by Christianity in the past, and so Christian moral values live on from generation to generation, even if people don't believe and they don't go to church on Sunday morning and they don't read the Bible. The Christian values actually live on. But I ask myself the question, is this going to go on forever? Is this outcome sustainable? I don't think so.
No.
I don't think these Christian values can last forever without a Christian faith to support them, to provide a foundation. So what is happening, the secularization in Sweden, I don't think it's a good outcome.
No.
Although change occurs very slowly, I don't think it's a good outcome for the country.
I see. So we might need more missionaries here in Sweden?
Yes, definitely.
Right.
Given what I've learned in my research, I've come to to appreciate missionaries much more than I earlier realized, because in addition to promoting Christianity, they're generating all these other social benefits that I had not thought about before I started reading about the subject.
I see. So thank you so much, Paul, for joining us. Och tack till er som har tittat. Varmt välkomna att titta på nästa avsnitt av Närbild som kommer ha samma tema men lite annorlunda inriktning. Då har vi med oss Mats Selander som är teolog och kommer tala om det verkligen finns en motsättning mellan vetenskap och tro.
Om du vill hjälpa oss här på Himlen TV7 att göra fler program och serier i arbetet för att sprida Guds glada budskap, stöd oss gärna med ett ekonomiskt bidrag. Du ser uppgifterna här i rutan. Tack för ditt stöd.